Record. So, welcome everybody to the second talk of the Parte workshop. We are happy to announce the talk of Rodolfo Basile from the University of Tartu and Turku on situative constructions and partitivity in Finnic. Dear Rodolfo, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So it is my pleasure to be here, really. Thank you for including me in this series of lectures. I'm honored. And I also thank my supervisors, Tuomas and Ilmari, to have introduced me to this series. So as Anne has already introduced, my name is Rodolfo Basile. I'm originally from Italy, but I study in Estonia, in Tartu, and I'm doing a joint degree with the University of Turku in Finland. And I'm a PhD student, and my talk is called Situative Constructions and Partitivity in Finnic. If the name situative sounds unfamiliar, it's because it should be. It's my term, and I will explain soon what it means. I hope I won't leave you wondering too much about it. I will do first a brief overlook of the main points of my talk. First of all, I want to introduce to you my theorization of these situative constructions, which are a semantically non-prototypical class of locational constructions. I say semantically non-prototypical because they can be both. They can be morphosyntactically also prototypical, as in prototypical locational constructions. But then again, the verb which characterizes them is usually strange, so to say. I will also do an overview of non-prototypical subjects in Finnic, very briefly further on. And I will explain why lexical existentials, so-called lexical existentials, are important in Finnic and what they mean. And my main hypothesis for this talk is that the verbs that characterize situative constructions are in Finnic maybe considered existential constructions par excellence. The verbs can be considered lexical existentials in the strict sense, because basically what happens is that if you replace them with a copula, usually the meaning doesn't really change. And this is also, of course, very much goes hand in hand with the partitive subjects or subject-like noun phrases. This talk is based on 4 main contributions, of which 2 are really in preparation, the middle 2 ones, but the other 2 are, well, forthcoming, and they're basically about to be published. I also put the abstract that I will present in SLE about these constructions in European languages. But also the main paper, which I'm still working on, forthcoming A. Then forthcoming B is an overview of Finnish partitive existential noun phrase constructions and how these constructions can be studied from a corpus linguistics point of view, with a method called Constructional Analysis. And fourth is my article my first article, which I wrote with my supervisor Ilmar Ivaska, and it's about the subject alternation between nominative and partitive in constructions containing the verb löytyä, which means to be found. And that's what a situative is, basically. First of all, I want to introduce to you locational predication, as it's, I think, important to understand why to consider a certain construction non-prototypical is to have a framework of reference of locational predication. It is hard to define because people always talk about non-prototypical locational predication, but then what is the criterion to define a prototypical one? We can say that a locational predication is a spatial relation, and it involves two percepts, as defined by Crisel in 2009, of which one is a figure, a semantic entity, or in maybe grammatical terms, coincides with a subject most of the time, and this figure is located in a ground or is in motion towards or from it. So if I say I am here, that's a spatial relation between the figure I and here, which is the ground, or I am in the house, or something like that. And the prototypical locational predication in European languages is usually defined on the basis of information structural patterns. So the figure would be the theme, and the ground would be the realm of the construction. If we walk away from this prototype, we have the so-called non-prototypical constructions, and the most studied have been so-called existential constructions or inverse locational predication or constructions. Both studied cross-linguistically by Crisel, and we also have presentational constructions, which for many languages are a bit of a borderline case with the existential ones. So the way existential constructions are defined in most of the literature is by morphosyntactic criteria. For example, matters of word order, as happens in Russian. So the example A, Doctor был в городе, means, that's a prototypical locational predication we talked about. So we have the first percept, the figure, doctor, and the town, which is the ground. But if we invert, by simply inverting word order, we have an existential. В городе был доктор. There was a doctor in town. Of course, this is a very simplistic way of looking at it, and it's not the scope of my talk, but Crisel gives good motivations for distinguishing between what many people call existentials, while they're actually just inverted locational constructions. Anyway, in languages like the Romance languages, the existential sentences are not really that transparent as in Russian in means of word order. For example, we have the French construction, following French construction, which is also very much used in Italian, but it's in Italian, it is also often considered existential. not presentational, or like a mixture of both. And there's a very thin line between the two types. And in Italian, it would be exactly the same. C'è Gianni che ti vuole parlare, or something like that. And in English, it doesn't really work because it with these defined reference there is presentational construction is not really used. That's why I put the little asterisk in brackets. So these are the two main types that are considered non-prototypical. But what I want to consider is another type, which I have already introduced, of semantically non-prototypical occasional constructions, which I call situatives, because they predicate where a reference situates itself through a semantically complex predicate, usually, which is usually a derived form. So it's also morphologically marked, and it's a derived form of the verb to find. Very much used in all over like European languages. So this verb is not exactly a copula, but on a construction level, it builds up this copula-like meaning. And if you're a bit confused by this, I will show you some concrete examples. I know that there are Italians as well, or people who understand Italian in the audience. So this is very common to use the verb trovare to find, derive the reflexive form trovarsi, and then conjugate it for all persons, basically, in sentences like mi trovavo in una situazione orribile. I was finding, or I found myself in a horrible situation. This works in English. It's abstract. It's an abstract kind of place, but in English it doesn't work. For example, with concrete locations, like the following example where we have l'Italia si trova nel Mediterraneo, so Italy is situated in the Mediterranean. Maybe we wouldn't say Italy is found in the Mediterranean in English, like could sound odd, but maybe native speakers can prove me wrong. So anyway, the point is, we use the verb to find while nobody is actually looking for Italy in the Mediterranean, right? So there is no reason, there would be no cognitive reason to say that Italy is found somewhere, but we still use this construction very much. As I already introduced, it's really widespread in languages of Europe, but I will, of course, show you just a few examples of different languages. One of them is Norwegian, where we have this derivation as well. So Finne is to find, and then morpheme, which indicates a medio-passive, or a very, also very flexible sort of morpheme that can be used in many situations. I segmented it. I tried not to segment examples too much, but here I thought it would be important to show the morpheme itself, as not many people are familiar with Norwegian, maybe. This is also what happens with Swedish, actually. I have no example of Swedish right here in this talk, but finnas in Swedish is used in the same way, and which makes sense because they're very closely related languages. But the interesting thing is that in Swedish, it is considered a pure existential, while I disagree a bit, because it has this added meaning to it, which is not purely existential, or doesn't really like doesn't really conform to the usual ways of forming an existential pattern or sentence, like, for example, the Russian word order variation. And another example is with Polish, which is also used in a first person, like Italian. We saw this mi trovavo, so I found myself. This is we found ourselves in Florida waters. And the interesting thing is that not all languages of Europe use them consistently, as in not all of them use them in a first person or a second person, but there are some languages like Germanic languages that mostly use it in the third person. So to describe reference that are not ourselves or our mates, so to say. As I already introduced, I use a semantic approach for studying these constructions, and I sketched two semantic categories. One is the finder and one is the found. The finder is the category that has the point of view over the situative construction. It's also a hypothetical agent, which causes the fictive process that precedes the finding. So the process doesn't need to happen, but even though verb semantics points towards it, right? So if we say, I find myself in a horrible situation, I mean, I'm not really looking for myself in the horrible situation, right? That's why it's fictive. But it does have this cognitive period of time over which there is this kind of searching going on. And the found, on the other hand, is the patient of the fictive process. So usually can coincide with the subject of the sentence. The first type, so types, I have defined them by checking for the co-reference between finder and found. And in a first type, there is not really a co-reference because the station is an inanimate, right? So it can't find itself. There is a schematic, I think it's called exophoric finder, which observes the action and sees that the station is located between these two cities. And German, yeah, I've found examples in the third person. So also German has this finden is to find, but then it has this kind of like causative or this kind of like prefix that attaches to usually many verbs for whatever functions really. A type 2 is found in modern Greek, and it is the same as the Italian, as the first example with Italian. So I find myself, where well, this is a different type because we have co-reference between the finder and the found. So cognitively, I am finding myself. So I'm both the finder and the found. And then before going to the third type, I should introduce co-expression patterns, which have been theorized by Genucciene in 1987. Well, that's how far I got in the research, but maybe somebody has spoken about them earlier. Anyway, they are used. That's one way of seeing reflexive markers, because they're usually very ductile grammatical strategies that, or grammatical elements that can occur in different functions or strategies. And usually we have 3 or more, for example, with Romance languages: reflexive, reciprocal, impersonal, or another function. One example is the Italian C, reflexive C, where we have in A, we have Marco si lava, so a reflexive. B is quasi mangia bene, so A is an impersonal. So here people eat well, or here one eats well. In C, we have a reciprocal, they hate each other to death, si odiano a morte. And in D, we have this very interesting use, very redundant also, where we don't really need the reflexive pronoun, but it's still there, and it's called the Media Transitive. It was called like that by Massini in 2012. So Marco si mangia un gelato, even though it has this reflexive material, it still means like Marco eats ice cream. And this brings me to type 3, where we have an ambiguity. So we either have a situation similar to the type 1, where the referent, where the finder is external and doesn't really participate in the action or in the event, or we have an impersonal. So this could mean the hotel is located in a calm area, or the hotel situates itself in a calm area, or it could also mean the hotel is found by people in a calm area. Basically, that's like, at least my cognitively, it makes sense also in Italian. In Finnic, let's get to the partitive part of the talk. Before talking about situative strategies in Finnic, I will introduce what partitive subjects are. As many of you may know, in Finnish and Estonian, there is a dedicated partitive grammatical case, which is rare, typologically speaking. And this case can express like a number of functions. The most studied ones are, for example, object, differential object marking, or subject marking. They alternate with what is called totalitive, so it's a totalative case, which is a syncretic case including total objects, or that are usually in genitive or nominative plural, or for example, it also includes nominative objects in imperative constructions. I think there's a mistake there. The imperative, my keyboard was set to Estonian, so it corrected it, but imperative constructions. And also prototypical subjects in nominative are totalitive, could be considered totalitive. One like very old problem arises, that can partitive elements or partitive noun phrases be considered subjects, because they are non-prototypical, morphosyntactically speaking, but they also create this kind of like holistic point of view over the event. So they are associated with existential constructions. They trigger existential constructions most of the times. And for this reason, instead of calling them subjects, researchers like Humo and Hellasvuo or Metzlang have suggested different nomenclatures. In particular, Humo and Hellasvuo have suggested ENP, so existential noun phrase, and that's what I usually use. In Finnic, situatives can be characterized by partitive subjects or partitive ENPs, existential noun phrases. Of course, when we talk about E and P, we're not talking only about partitive subjects or partitive elements, but also about nominative existential subjects. So nominative elements that are placed in clause final position, which in Finnish usually has an existential reading. And there are two examples from the two main or most known Estonian, the Finnic languages, Estonian and Finnish. As you can see, this in Estonian, there's this leituma verb. I also tried not to segment too much, but I wanted to show this uralic u morpheme, which indicates usually reflexivity or valency, how's it called? Valency reduction, really. And the same as in Finnish, which, well, it's rendered as u, but it's because of the vowel harmony, but it's still the same morpheme. So the one that's marked with reflexive. So as you can see from the translations, they are like existential sentences, and this is all because of the partitive case. Usually, in Finnic, as I said, prototypical existential sentences have a verb final existential noun phrase, but if they are in a clause final existential noun phrase, but if this existential noun phrase is impartitive, it can also be shifted to a clause initial position and still have an existential reading, like in Finnish erojakin toki löytyy. All right. So it appears that situatives in Finnic are of the type 1. So they have an external finder, and usually there is no coreferentiality with found. So it's usually not used in first or second person. And it's also not used with animate subjects, like, I don't know, Marko löytyy metsästä. Marko is found in the forest. Doesn't sound right for some reason. But it is used both with concrete and abstract locations. So very widely used. Although I think in Estonian is way less used than in Finnish, and prescriptivists criticize the use of löytyä, the Finnish löytyä, in current language, because they find it's they consider it a Swedish influence, which is very possible, but they discourage its use. So with partitive E and Ps, we can have the verb to be in constructions of existential constructions with the copula, basically. But we can also have the so-called lexical existentials. There is a long list of them in Larjavaara's book, which is a book about the partitive in Finnish, and I think it's an amazing book, and it's really a game changer for the field. And it has this long list of lexical existentials, which are intransitive verbs that, first of all, are different from copulas. Then they can appear in a construction that features an existential noun phrase, but they also predicate both the existence of something as well as at what it is doing. So they act like both copulas, and like they say that something is there and it's doing something. An example with Finnish would be kadulla juoksee koiria, where we have this very typical existential construction with the verb juosta, to run, in the third singular. So there is no agreement with the dog, the ENP, final ENP. Then we have a final ENP, koiria, and this ENP is also in partitive. So interesting that also that Finnish doesn't really allow agreement in this kind of constructions. Then I came to the conclusion that some lexical existentials are more existential than others, since I studied them in Finnish web corpora. And namely, I took 10 different lexical existentials based on the frequency they had in these corpora. And these corpora are basically also very everyday Finnish, so they're web forums. So I analyzed these the occurrence of these 10 existentials with partitive ENPs with a constructional analysis, with the method called constructional analysis, which was developed by Stefanovic and Gries in 2003, and then it's been around for almost 20 years now, and it has undergone some changes and some implementations, but the main idea is that it is based on construction grammar as theorized by Goldberg, for example, or Croft, and the idea is that we have a construction like the Finnish partitive ENP, and we have a series of lexemes, which they call lexemes because they co-appear in this construction. And well, with quantitative methods, we can see how strongly these lexemes are attracted to this construction, and we can compare the results, the numbers between them, and make basically a graded sort of list of which ones are the most strongly associated compared to others. So I won't dig in, I won't go into detail, but some of these verbs turned out to be more strongly associated than others with existential constructions. And the first one was exactly this situative verb, to be found, löytyä. And then we had mahtua, to fit, sata, to rain, and riittää, to suffice. And I don't think this is casual, like this massive usage of these verbs with the partitive that points towards existentiality is, in my opinion, not by chance. Also because if we exclude sata, which also is usually used with partitive, right? Because there's an interesting article about this. I don't remember, but exactly. But anyway, sata is usually used with partitive, so we can say it's kind of like they usually go together. You say sata vettä, it rains water in Finnish, not sata vesi in nominative. So yeah. Anyway, except for this verb, these three verbs, löytyä, mahtua, and riittää, they behave in a very close way to the prototypical to be the prototypical existential. So I consider them lexical existential in a strict sense. For example, we have the Finnish example, ruokaa riitti, there was a lot of food, or there was food. The verb used is suffice, but the meaning is not that food was barely enough for everybody, but that there was enough food for everybody. So there was a lot of food for everybody. And compared to this, if we put the noun food in the nominative, so instead of ruoka, we chop off that final A and we just say ruoka riitti, then we have a prototypical subject. And in that case, it has this more prototypical reading as well. So it will mean there was enough. I mean, the food is enough, or the food suffices for everybody. And this is very interesting, in my opinion. Going back to the nominative partitive alternation, I took an example from our article, mine and Ilmari's. And by contrast, I also put the partitive variant, which wasn't there. So the one we found in the corpus was tuotteet löytyy myös rannasta, which is in nominative. And it translates as products are found also on the beach. So the nominative in Finnish doesn't guarantee that the construction will be semantically speaking a situative. Like, it doesn't guarantee that, like, because it's very tightly bound with existentiality. So when there's no existentiality, so there's a nominative prototypical subject, this verb also gets a more prototypical reading. So if you say, if you substitute a copula there, so you say something like tuotteet on rannassa or rannalla, then it's just not the same, I think. But of course, I may need some native speakers to back me up. In contrast, if you put it in the partitive case, it gives it an existential reading. And if you make the existential sentence even more prototypical, like rannasta löytyy myös tuotteita, then I think it's more close to the purely existential reading. So of like, there are products on the beach. And to support this, I thought to make the contrast even more evident, I'm not sure whether this example would be considered by a native, like valid by a native speaker, but I've heard this many times when, for example, this is very like a discourse situation, or like a very, it's bound to the, it's very situational, sort of, in the sense that we have a prototypical subject and we're looking for it, so to say, and we go around the house and ask our roommate, missä se on, so where is it? And then before we give the other person the time to answer, we say ei kun löytyy. So wait, I found it, no problem. I didn't know how to gloss eiku, but I glossed it as discourse marker, but it's probably wrong. So this has a more, also because of this perfective aspect, has a more prototypical way of considering the predicate, which has the whole process involved. And so some conclusions maybe good to do. In Finnic, situative constructions may feature partitive ENPs instead of canonical subjects. So partitive ENPs can be included in these löytyä constructions, and they when they feature a partitive ENP, they overlap with existential constructions. And for this reason, these situatives can be considered lexical existentials in the strict sense, at least in Finnish, where it's relevant to do so. And well, I think this overlapping of the two constructions corroborates the idea according to which situatives express the same meaning as the copula in prototypical occasional constructions on a clause-semantic level, but also, of course, in existential constructions. And the last point is the partitive ENP helps forgetting, so to say, the prototypical meaning of the predicate to be found. So it helps forgetting the whole process that was before we found this, the referent, basically. And here are some references. I will be happy to answer questions and some acknowledgements. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo. It was a very nice and round talk. In Estonian, there is a saying, kes otsib, see leiab. So the one who searches finds. And you have found a construction, and you have searched for it, and you have found it. Now the floor is to those who have questions. I would just suggest that you, Cecilia raised a hand.
Well, thank you for the interesting talk. I just have a comment and some remarks. So the comment is, I don't think that Gianni si mangia un gelato, so the one, you know, with the C, is actually completely expletive, you know, that C. It's not completely void of meaning, because there is work done on the Southern Italian dialects where they show that this C in Gianni si mangia un gelato is actually a terminative marker. So it's actually an aspectual marker. So it's not really redundantly there, because if you say Gianni si mangia un gelato, you sort of imply that, you know, the ice is not there any longer at the end of the action. So it means, it seems to me that, you know, this is something interesting to consider, also because one doesn't know how reflexive critics become an aspectual marker in a sense. So it will be interesting. And then, you know, I was sort of intrigued by your idea of the finder and the findee. So if you could comment more on that, because I was wondering whether this finder is actually the speaker or not. Looking at the Germanic languages, at least in German, one of the problems I have as a non-mother tongue speaker is that I never know in these constructions when I have to use be, when I have to use stand, sit, or lay, because they use all these things, you know, and some, you know, for people it's more or less obvious that, you know, you stand when you stand, you sit when you sit, you know, but sometimes it depends on the shape of the object, how they do it. And I was wondering whether, you know, this seems to me to be some point of view, to include some point of view. So it must be the point of view of the speaker, I thought. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting points and comments. So about the first one, yes, I actually formulated it myself in my head when I thought, oh, but when I say this, it means that I eat it up, basically, the ice cream. Yeah, and mi mangio un gelato or mangiati un gelato or something like this. And I'm namely exactly from the south, so it's very common there. So yes, I said it's void of meaning, but actually you're completely right, and I should have noted it down also. For some reason, when you said it, it just rang a bell. So. Yes, about this, yeah, the Germanic thing, I haven't given it any thought. Of course, I thought like, oh, but then you can theorize any other construction with like liegen and all these the Germanic stems that are very common, really. and like very difficult to master for foreigners. But yeah, that's also, I will note it down because it's also something worth considering. But I'm afraid I can't really answer that. May need a bit more research on my side.
I don't know, but the idea that just occurred to me was that, you know, the subject is in a sense less a prototypical subject because somehow there is the speaker, you know, which is the finder, that, you know, it's the person who has to provide the perspective in those cases, who is sort of acting as some sort of, you know, background agent, you know, of all. Or if you can say there is an agent there, you know, taking perspective. And that's why you can also mark those items as partitives. If you think in German, there is even a script with an accusative.
Yes, yes. But well, because the verb is also like, it has this accusative meaning, right? So it gives, but yeah, interesting, very interesting. That's also like usually considered an existential in literature, like es gibt, but I don't know. I don't know if it's just that. I think, yeah, there might be more complex on a semantic level.
Thank you. Any other questions? I don't see any raised hands. I have a question. So imagine yourself, like we are here, your audience, and potentially if we put this video online, other people speaking other languages will look at the situatives that you present, and they are thinking, okay, do I have it in my language? Could you summarize in a nutshell, what should they be looking for? So you gave us word order, you gave us partitive subjecthood, you gave us an idea of something, a finder and a findee, that they should be somewhere, but the finder is something you will not be able to capture very easily. So what diagnostics would you suggest, or what kinds of stimuli to elicit the situatives would you offer to somebody who is doing fieldwork on, for instance, the Mordvinian languages or whatever?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think the thing to consider mostly is this, like to think whether there is exactly an existential or existential-like verb that functions in, well, as a situative, and it is to consider, for example, whether, in my opinion, it's important to see whether it can be used for talking about myself, talking about others only, talking about see the difference between abstract and concrete locations, or abstract and concrete reference, because that's what I observed. It seems that it's the most changing parameter in also within European languages. Like English is problematic in this sense, as it does have a sort of prototypical situative construction where you have a reflexive marker involved, but that's only it only seems to work with abstract reference, and I mean abstract locations, while when in English, when you say something is in a concrete location, then you will use is found, for example. So it's this kind of like passive, it has this cognitively a bit different, like this kind of or either impersonal or bit different reading. But with more Finnic languages, I'm not entirely sure. I know it's just an example, but with
I just meant any other language, like let's say you want to find these kinds of constructions in other languages as well. What's your way to go and find out if another language has this construction?
Yeah, well, that's from the point of view of this kind of like language documentation is like, I'm not sure. I mean, I've never done it, so it might need some thinking.
Okay, thank you. I just think that people speaking many languages are potentially interested in your talk. Are there any more questions? There is maybe something. Okay, there is somebody saying hello, but anyone questions from other languages? Comments?
No, just a question. Well, about the difference between nominative and partitive. So it was not completely clear to me when you used the nominative and when the partitive. Could you please explain it again?
Yes, of course. You mean in the framework of these situative constructions, or in general?
Yes, sorry, with the existential and in the subject position.
Oh yeah. So, basically, the first example here from Finnish is it is like twofold, in the sense that if we use tuotteet with the nominative, then we have a prototypical subject. Well, Finnish works in this way that if you then flip the order of within the sentence, then you will have a clause initial locational adverbial. So this rannasta, which is now in the end of the sentence. And then you will have this tuotteet, so products, in the end of the sentence. And that is also existential. I mean, an existential sentence is also the one that has a nominative subject, sort of subject, in the final position, in clause final position. So rannasta löytyy myös tuotteet, right? And in that case, we have an existential noun phrase in nominative. This existential noun phrase can also appear in partitive, and partitive is the criterion for which the sentence semantics almost always turns into an existential sentence. So in that case, whether you have tuotteita, which is partitive, in the beginning or in the final part of the sentence, it makes almost no difference in its interpretation, namely that it will be an existential. I don't know if I answered your question, but if you have more or less.
So you can have both in both positions.
Yes, but the difference is only when almost only when the nominative is in clause initial. In that case, it would be a prototypical subject, hence not existential. But another important difference is that of the quantity of the referent. So if you have this nominative partitive alternation, when you have nominative, it's usually a closed quantity, while partitive indicates an open one. That's also a very important semantic difference. And yeah, that's more or less it in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you. Difficult to learn, I guess, for second language learners.
Yeah, exactly. Very difficult.
Thank you for the question and the answer. Questions? Clarifications?
Hello, this is Ilmari speaking. Just to sort of adapt to what Rodolfo was saying regarding the function of the partitive in that context. So I would say that with regard to these lexical existentials, so then the partitive case also sort of rules out the non-existential reading of the sentence. So basically, that's one way of indicating the existential meaning of the whole sentence is indicated by the partitive case of the NP. So if in case there is a nominative, which was what Petra was asking in the first place, so the nominative can leave open the question with regard to the overall meaning of the sentence. It could be either existential or non-existential, but with the partitive subject or the partitive NP, so then the existential reading is the only one possible. Basically, that's the, I guess, the very core difference within this construction that Rodolfo was talking about.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As we are on this page, I would like to point out that if you would look at the Estonian equivalent of the first sentence about the products here, so what you would have as a difference is the agreement marking on the verb. So what you wouldn't have here with the nominatives is leidub. You have an agreement with in number. So if you have tooteid, then you would have the singular agreement. That's the part with the partitive. But if you have the nominative, you would need to have leiduvad, tooted leiduvad.
Leiduvad, yeah.
Right. So I think it might be a relevant difference between Estonian and Finnish, which is quite similar.
Yeah, I mean, this sentence was a bit of a particular case we found in our article, because it's exactly like this tuotteet should, like in this position, should agree with the verb. So it should be tuotteet löytyvät, right? But mostly in spoken language, you usually have this reduction to one only third singular. Basically, you only have third singular. There's virtually no use of the third plural form, which is just fairly longer, and just you have all the information in the suffix of the nominative plural. So yeah, I mean, this was a bit of a particular case, but it still doesn't have the existential reading in this form tuotteet löytyy. So the agreement, the non-agreement of verb and subject it's not necessary to define it as an existential.
Yeah, thank you. Questions?
Yes, I was wondering if you compare it to French, maybe Tabea knows more about it. Maybe you were thinking also about it, Tabea, because I saw that you were raising your hand. But in French, you can have with an idea construction and then il y a des produits sur la plage. But you can also have des produits se trouvent sur la plage. So I was wondering if it relates to this difference. But I think, Tabea, that there is a slight difference between the two sentences.
Yeah, I was going to comment on this as well. Thank you, Petra, for mentioning the Ilia construction. So it's true that in many of these examples, when the subject is partitive or has a partitive case, then in French we have a construction with the partitive article. The difference in the examples that you mentioned, Petra, I would say that it's really existential when you have Ilia. But I have the same confusion sometimes with the examples that you mentioned, Rodolfo, when if it's presentational or really existential as an interpretation. So sometimes it's not quite clear, right? So that would be maybe the same difference in the examples that Petra mentioned in French between se trouver and il y a.
Interesting. Thank you. I had never thought about this, because Italian doesn't do the same. So I automatically think like, okay.
So there are interesting parallels, I think, with French that could be investigated.
Nice, nice. It's just I don't know enough about French. So. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Tabea, as well. I have to tell you that I see a raised hand for some reason with this recording mode only after you start asking the question for some reason. So be brave and ask the question. I cannot give you the word. Is there a question? Then please speak up, because I don't, for some reason I don't see the raised hand. Okay, I have a question about the lexical existentials and other similar constructions, or I would rather speak about verbs. So you have verbs such as leiduma, which contain this u suffix at the end, kind of reflexive, medial. So verbs of this kind have been described also under the common denominator of unaccusatives in a lot of literature, which is not perhaps typological or cognitive, but there is a lot of discussion of unaccusative verbs and their relation to partitive subjects in Finnic. And what I would kind of think that you have leiduma as a verb, and it has this u suffix, but you have very similar, semantically quite similar verbs that you can very nicely replace with a copula olema, such as asuma, to be in a place, or osetsema. And for some reason, they are not unaccusative and they do not have partitive subjects. Or do they?
You're probably right.
There is something with the suffixation in these languages, and I'm wondering if Finnish also shows that. So in Estonian you have something weird going on there.
Interesting, yeah. Actually, if we consider these one that I said, they're lexical existentials in the strict sense, then two of them have this unaccusative, so löytyä and mahtua in Finnish, and mahtua is also like used with partitive, is also like a very copular use, sort of like purely existential. But Rita doesn't really have this morpheme. But it's an interesting point you raised. I had never thought of it that way. But does asuma, for example, have it? That is not like, that doesn't really have this Uralic u, right? Morpheme.
Well, I'm not sure that the origin really is important. What the language normativists didn't like in the Soviet times, they tried to root out anything that was Russian-like in Estonia, and they very much disliked this u suffix, which they thought is a kind of an easy translation of a Russian construction, this sta at the end. mutsa
yeah.
So and I think there were many complaints about the terrible spread of the U suffix, that it is something Russian-like and something to be avoided, and that earlier it wasn't like that. And so, but it feels very good in the Estonian language. Somehow it spreads without any Russian influence now. So I don't know what to make out of it, but there is something interesting about these lexical conditions. Maybe there is this book by Rätsep on the eesti keele lihtlausete tüübid or something like that, and there are quite many frame alternations, argument structural alternations, and I'm sure the partitive subjects are part of them. But one characteristic of them is that they have some kind of a spectral feature, like maybe like what Cecilia was talking about, the eating verbs, where if you look compositionally at the aspect, with the eating you have actually two things that can be filled or that can be disappeared. You have something that you eat, right? So aspect will keep tabs on where you are in the eating of the ice cream, right? So if you and on the other hand, you have also somebody who is eating, and the kind of a border of whether that person finds it enough or sufficient also might play a role in the aspectual interpretation. If you take a perspective from the eater and not the ET, or so how to say that, the thing that is eaten. And but with the intransitives, what you could also see is that you have the verbs such as riita or mahtua, and you have the same verbs in Estonian as well, and they are also with partitive subjects, right? So so there is some kind of a norm or some kind of one whole that you kind of a quantified whole that you can think of, and that is kind of either filled or satisfied or reached to the end, aspectually speaking, or not. And if it is not, then it's often partitive in the Estonian case as well.
Yeah, and that also correlates with the notion of open quantity, for example. Yeah. Like you have an open quantity, and it's so open that it's like for example with Rita, like partitive, so it means that there's really a lot of food and not like people are not going to eat it up, basically. So yeah, that's a good point.
So here you can see that something homogeneous is the subject matter or something like that. So I think Tuomas has written about Finnish in the paper that you referred to at the end of your slides, for instance, where he is looking at I believe Krivka and the formal semantics literature about the conditions of quantification of the subject and object matter, perhaps object rather.
Yeah.
In relation to this, if I may, it's true that in French as well, we have this idea that, you know, when you have de or du, right? So the partitive article, you have this non-specified quantity, right? So it's parallel to this idea that you mentioned for the partitive case, where you have a quantity that is not, I don't remember the term that you used, but not determined, right? So it's also something that you find for French, typically for du and de, you know, partitive articles. So
like an open quantity.
Yeah.
But is it sorry if I interrupt you, but is it compulsory in French? Like, because in Italian you can say bevo caffè, so I drink coffee, and it means it's a partitive, right? So I drink some coffee.
Well,
but
when I said partitive, I simply meant the presence of the partitive article. The meaning is very often not partitive, right? So in French, you have to say "je bois du café," so you have to. It is
right?
Compulsory. Yeah, it's always compulsory. We don't have bare nouns. So in some context where in Italian you could have bare nouns, we also have du des. So it's slightly different. Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Thank you, Tabea, and thank you, Rodolfo, for the answers. Do we have more questions?
I have a small question.
Okay, go ahead.
What about the verb rain? Is it metaphorical or what? I can't imagine what kind of sentence you meant with the verb to rain.
It's basically, it's like when you learn Finnish, for example, they tell you sata always goes with partitive, right? And that's because it's when it's used. What kind
of subject? What kind of
there was this study that I started to talk about it, but I unfortunately don't remember who wrote it, but that had rain as some sort of like godly source, like a god sending rain from above. So it would be an accusative reading, sort of. So it has this object like subject. So you say sata lunta. Lumi would be the nominative snow, but then lunta is the partitive. So you say sata lunta. But what I found in the corpus was that it was also used in metaphorical ways. Like you also have this kind of like prototypical subjects, like I don't know, commented sata, like comments were raining. Like
yes, that's what I was imagining. Because it's not the rain rains or something like that.
No, not necessarily.
From the rain rains. Okay.
But I would say that in relation to these weather expressions in Finnish and also in some other languages, I think but in Finnish at least, it's very debatable whether the partitive, what's the role in the sentence for the partitive, because they behave in very different manner than any other of the sentences that Rodolfo was talking about. So it could also be that then the partitive actually just indicates that it's the object rather than having anything to do with the subjecthood or the potential sort of existentiality in that sense. And it may be just an indicator of a clause type that is completely apart from the other ones. And there's a very interesting typological study on the weather expressions across languages, and they very often behave in a manner that is different from any other sentences. And I think that also holds true to when it comes to Finnish, in the sense that I would treat it separately from the other lexical existentials that Rodolfo was talking about, because of this phenomenon that I think it's even less clear what's the role of the partitive element in that sentence in the first place.
I thought perhaps the not bounded quantity could be, but I haven't any idea. Yeah.
I guess that is a way to look at it, but it's also probably much different, as Inmari was saying. So yeah, but we do have occurrences of like close quantities with rain, like occurrences with like I don't know if you can say something like sata kaikki vedet, like all the waters fell or something. But something like that, like you have a nominative, it's also present in corpora.
Well, I was thinking of an example in Estonian. I think we have examples, like, for instance, if you want to say that the whole snow for the whole winter fell down in November, for instance.
Yeah.
Kogu talve lumi sadas novembri jooksul maha, for instance, then you might have the nominative there.
Yeah.
Questions, comments, suggestions? We have a PhD student here.
I have a small remark about, it was one of the first constructions that you presented, first sentences, and you called it a non-prototypical existential, and I have written it down in French. Maybe the example was also in French. Il y a Jean qui veut te parler. There is, yeah, that sentence. Presentational, yeah. In fact, yeah, it is. It is rather a focalization construction, I think. So it is what you are doing here is focalizing Jean.
Yeah.
Maybe it can also be a broad focus, even. What happened?
Yeah.
So I think that it's not really a presentational construction.
Yeah, it's one of those very difficult to define, but yes, this also because also in Italian when you have the equivalent, so this c'è construction, that is also always in focus. Like you always have it at the beginning, or well, you can have it also in the end, but then you have a like focused construction. Like you have this ambiguation. Like I don't know if you're asking who's in, and you say Jean c'è, so you mean, oh, he is in, but not the others, or something. So, but yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, any more questions? Perhaps if there are no more questions, we could repeat again, Leia. So we wish you a lot of luck in searching for the finding constructions and
thank you very much.
Figuring out who the imaginary watcher or looker for or searcher or perceiver or perspective taker is, that, and how to capture that fictive character. And thank you very much. And I would also like to announce the next speaker. You can use the
sharing
link, and her name is Giovanna Albonico, and she will talk about partitives in the Mordvinian languages, or Mordvinic, which is a Uralic language as well. So we have 2 Uralic talks by Italians, which we are very happy about. Thank you, Rodolfo.
Thank you.
So I think I will now end the recording.